Hey everybody, it's Real Talk with Pimpcron, and today we are discussing when are proxies okay and what proxies are okay. Because there's a wide world of proxies out there, everything from your tissue box land raider all the way up to, really 3D printed miniatures that look almost identical to the real model. Those are also proxies. So, and then also when is it okay to proxy? Now, of course, this is your game. You know your community. You know how you play and what's acceptable. Ultimately, it does come down to whatever you're willing to do. And if you've got like a tight budget or whatever, a lot of people proxy. If you want to try out some units before you buy them, you might want to proxy. I mean, there's many different ways that you might proxy, and in different circles and different communities, it's going to be more or less acceptable. But I'm just talking generally seen by the population of Warhammer players. What is acceptable and what isn't? Well, I can tell you right now, a shoebox land raider in most communities is not acceptable. Like, you got to put some sort of effort into it. Okay, so shoebox land raider, soda can drop pod, those are not acceptable proxies. Okay. I ran into one when I was looking at the Winehammer community, and it really had me on the fence. So this person did a whole Cities of Sigmar proxy army, and they're like, "Haha, GW price hikes, take this!" And he's got a full 3,000 points of Cities of Sigmar, and they are all printed out pictures from the internet, and they're about the right size, and he put them on the right size bases with hot glue, and they are literally just printed paper with bases. And I was so on the fence about it because ultimately, I mean, I'm just going to say it goes without saying, you just do whatever you want, right? And you can take the social consequences if people are side eyeing you or whatever. But I'm talking personally and from what I've seen. If you intend that for to be your whole army, to just print out pieces of paper, that might be fine for you, but you have to remember that this is a two-player game and your partner more than likely has assembled their models. Hopefully they've painted their models, they've based their models. You've got a mat on the board, you've got terrain on the board that's hopefully painted. I mean, you're setting up this whole like diorama essentially, and some asshats got a whole paper craft printed out army. I don't know, man. If you wanted to do that at proxying one unit, right, that would be fine. If you wanted to proxy two units, okay, whatever, right? Maybe you ordered the models, but you're so anxious to play with them that you're proxying this one unit. Okay, whatever. If you really, really want to do that. But what he made that sound like is that was his whole army. And I'm like, man, that's not acceptable. It just isn't. And I hate to be gatekeeping like that. I hate to be that way. But honestly, it's not acceptable. Like, you either participate. What if you played golf, right? And you insisted on only golfing with stale baguettes. And you're like, well, this is how I do it. I'm not buying expensive golf clubs. I'm just going to use this stale baguette. Or you bowl with watermelon. There's like a million. There, there comes a time in the hobby where you do have to participate in the hobby. Like, you do have to. It's not enough to just get your free rules and then print out your free army. It just, I don't know, man. I was on the fence about it because he did actually give some effort. He did put them on the proper size bases. He printed them out to be the proper size, roughly. I mean, that's all kind of, commendable. Okay, you did something. But come on, man. If you're planning that to be your only army forever, like, that's not cool. And while no one will kick him out of the game store for that, I really do feel like over time he would have a harder and harder time finding an opponent because people took their time and effort to make their stuff look good, and then they're the opposite side of the board. Because think about it, as a player, what you focus on is not your army, you focus on the opponent's army, right? So that's what they're seeing the whole game is a bunch of paper cutouts, and his particular way he did it was like he printed out the model but left the white around it. So it was vaguely the right size, but there was white background to it. It's not like he perfectly clipped them out. Now, if he had perfectly cut those models out, I would be much more impressed. I think it's a little out of line, but I would be much more impressed if he actually cut them out like every little nook and cranny. What about replacing units with other models? Um, there was one time in one of the narratives at Shorehammer, and you know me, I'm pretty relaxed about everything, so I don't really give a crap. because I just think it's a fun game. But people take things a little too seriously, I think, sometimes. At one of the Shore Hammers years ago, we had a player show up, and previously he had asked me and sent me pictures because any proxies need to be approved, right? He's like, "Hey, I've got a whole Troggoth army for Gloomspite gets, but I have instead of Troggoths, they're werewolves. They're on the right size base. They're about the right size, and Troggoths don't have any war gear. They have clubs, so my werewolves are just gonna have claws, and they werewolves regenerate just like Troggoths. So, is there an issue?" And I was like, "Nah, man, it's a narrative game. I mean, whatever." I might have the slightest reservation about a tournament because they aren't exactly what you're saying they are, so that can be a little confusing for people. But they don't have war gear, so there's nothing to confuse there. And his entire army was the werewolf leader, the Dankhold Troggoth, and then Rock Troggoths. So I mean, he only had two different types of units. So I don't know about a tournament. I'm glad we didn't cross that bridge because that's a little iffy territory for me. But in a narrative, I'm like, who the hell cares? They're werewolves. Like the and they were painted. They were based. Like he wasn't just ripping werewolves off the shelf and plopping them down for a narrative. Like he that was the way he played his army, and I enjoy doing that as well. I mean, I've got armies that are themed and proxied and things like that. So I really didn't think it was a big deal, but I did have a couple people complain like, "Well, that's not even a real GW army." And I'm like, "Yeah, but he was using the GW rules and they are a pretty darn good proxy for it. They've got regeneration and they've all that. I mean, they're a pretty good proxy as far as proxies go. But a few people, one or two people, had something to say about it. So that is just further illustrating that some people are going to be okay with your proxies, other people aren't. The more rule sticklers, well, actually, that's not a real GW. Is that 90% GW plastic? Like, whatever, man. But in my personal opinion, and I think most people won't care, if he brought his werewolves to his gaming club and said, "Hey, do you mind if I play against these? It's just 2 units and they have no war gear." So you know exactly. I'll even give you the sheet of what I'm playing with so you know exactly what they do. I think 70% of people would have no issue with that whatsoever because he painted them, they're the right size, they're on the right base, and it's not confusing. One of the biggest principles of a proxy is to make sure it's not confusing. So let's go back to papercraft. I said the tissue box land raider, just straight up buying a tissue box and saying this is my land raider is totally not acceptable. I mean sure, on your kitchen counter with some friends or something like that. But typically, most game stores are going to look down at it, and because you're breaking immersion completely. But I have seen some fantastic papercraft of rhinos and land raiders and things like that, where people printed it all out and made it, and it's the right size and it's 3D, and they put all the. I mean, people go way deep into papercraft, and honestly, I wouldn't have any issue with that. What it really comes down to when you're talking about proxies is the immersion in the game. Does it break immersion? So it's kind of funny that I was saying that that one army I don't think is acceptable to do an entire army and expect that to be your whole army when he didn't cut them out all together and all of that, and that was papercraft. But then I turn around and say land raiders and rhinos I've seen that were true papercraft and were done well. I mean, who cares? At that point, they're painted and they're assembled and they're the right size. I don't have any problem with that. And I think most of you probably would have no problem with that either. And the main reason is that it doesn't break immersion. So at that juncture, the only real difference is that, I mean, it's probably obviously papercraft, but that's not a huge deal because if it's done well, it can have a ton of detail to it. But it's not made of plastic. That's basically the main difference between a very well done papercraft rhino and a plastic rhino is that the papercraft rhino is not made of plastic. And is that really the line we're going to draw? It's got to be made of plastic. Then the argument would be made, what about fine cast? What about metal? What about 3D printing? I mean, come on. I just I don't think anybody will have an issue with that. So when you're doing a proxy, you're going to want to make sure one of the main rules is that it's not confusing for your opponent. Okay? It would have been a little better if his werewolves did have some sort of club, because then that is a direct one for one. A club is a club. Okay? And then all they got to remember is, oh, these just look different. And I think a lot of people would probably have slightly less problems if he gave his werewolves clubs instead of claws. But the next thing is it can't break immersion. So once again, Cutout paper army is not acceptable. Highly detailed papercraft rhino is acceptable by most people's standards, and it's because it doesn't break immersion. And I really don't think that you can do anything for papercraft for soldiers because it's going to end up looking 2D. And even that guy, if he cut all the whites around the models, it would still be immersion breaking because they're 2D and they're very obviously 2D. So I think where you really get stopped there is probably vehicles. You really can't do monsters. You really can't do soldiers. It's basically just vehicles. And that's okay, I think, if it's done well. The third thing is if you're going to be proxying, you have to get permission from the other player because I mean, it is a two-player game, and they're going to be staring at the other end of it. So they need to be able to see your proxy, and they have to be able to go, okay, I can determine what that is. I'll keep in mind what that is, whatever. And I think in most cases that will get you out of trouble because you're getting approval from the person. What about 3D printed models? I think in most cases the community is getting more and more and more accepting of 3D printed models, whether they be a true proxy like a werewolf for a troll, or a proxy like these are my Terminators, but they're obviously not GW, but they look 90%, 95% like a Terminator, and they have all the right war gear. I think most people accept 3D printing now. I've seen some. I've got a friend Ted up in New Jersey, and he's got 3D printed catechins that if you didn't know Games Workshop didn't make new catechins, or maybe they do now. I don't recall. But at the time when I saw them, GW didn't make new catechins, and I was like, wow, these are the coolest, most realistic looking catechins I've ever seen. And he's like, oh yeah, I 3D printed that. I'm like, oh my god, that's awesome. So in that case, people would be thrilled to see your 3D printed catechin proxies because they look so much better than the real model. So I don't think anybody has a real issue with 3D printing anymore. I think that time has passed where people had it up in their butt that you can't do 3D printing. But you'll notice one thing I said about the 3D printing is that they had the proper weapons. Now, sometimes, like for a melee weapon, okay, you can say that, a club can be replaced for claws if there's no other options because that's the only option and it can only be one stat line. Okay, you can argue that point, but I think it's completely not acceptable to be proxying a melt-a-gun for a flamer or a power sword for a power fist or any of the weapons that actually matter. It's one thing to proxy the unit because you like, oh, I'm going to only do Wolfen style Space Wolves, so I 3D printed these Wolfen Primaris Marines that aren't actually Wolfen, but they're hairy and all that. Okay, that's totally fine. But they better have their bolt guns, they better have their power swords and all that, or people start getting irritated. And of course, who usually does that? It's the immature, typically younger, and definitely cheaty people. They're like, oh, this turn it's a flamer. Wait, no. I mean, in the next turn, it's like, oh, no, I meant it was a melt-a-gun. Like, hold up, dude. You need to actually know what it is, and you can't be flip-flopping whenever it benefits you. So, I think I basically covered all the basics of proxying. Once again, it really depends on your community and your opponent. But I would be willing to say if your weapons are wrong and it breaks immersion and it's confusing, then you've got a bad proxy and you should go back to the drawing board. So, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And I will see you in episode 235 of the Pimpcron Warhammer podcast. And thanks to GameMat.eu and Panhandle3D.com and my beautiful, sexy, succulent, just always moist Patreon patrons. I'll see you next week.